Hello, my name is Sean Ash. I'm currently studying Counselling Level 2 at London South East Colleges, and I have a background in politics and philosophy. As a neurodivergent individual and a wheelchair user, my journey into counselling has been both fascinating and thought-provoking. My studies have led me to reconsider Freud's model of the id, ego and superego, alongside Karl Marx's concept of base and superstructure. How changes in the base can influence the superstructure. In this context, I've begun to explore how changes in our cognitive structures, particularly through language, could alter our emotional and psychological processes. To ensure my ideas are solid, irrefutable, and scientifically sound, I've used AI as a tool to test and refine these theories. What follows is a new perspective and hypothesis offering a different approach to therapy. Please note, however, that I am not yet qualified in this field, and this is simply a thought-provoking theory meant to inspire further discussion and exploration. The ego as a post hoc rationalizer, a scientific reinterpretation of Freud's model. Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche, composed of the id, ego and superego, has provided a foundational framework for understanding human behavior and decision-making. While Freud's model is widely accepted in psychoanalysis, the dynamics of how the id, ego and superego interact have been subject to much debate. This presentation proposes a fresh interpretation of Freud's model, asserting that the ego does not actively regulate the impulses of the id as traditionally understood. Instead, the ego operates primarily as a post hoc rationalizer that justifies the decisions and actions initiated by the id. Through this reinterpretation, I will argue that the ego functions to explain, reconstruct and provide meaning to the emotional impulses generated by the id, rather than mediate between them and the moral constraints of the superego. The role of the ego: justification, not mediation. The traditional Freudian model suggests that the ego serves as the regulator, mediating between the id's impulsive desires and the superego's moral restrictions. The id is driven by unconscious instincts and desires, while the superego strives to uphold moral and social values. In this traditional view, the ego is tasked with balancing these two forces and ensuring that behavior remains socially acceptable. However, modern psychological research and theories of decision-making challenge this view of the ego as an active mediator. Neuroscientific research, for instance, has shown that decisions and behaviors are often driven by emotions and instincts originating in the limbic system. These emotional responses tend to precede cognitive processes such as rational thinking and deliberation. For example, the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, processes emotions like fear, anger or pleasure and can trigger immediate behaviors such as fleeing or lashing out before the prefrontal cortex, responsible for the rational thought, intervenes. This order of events suggests that emotional impulses come first and influence our decisions. The ego then functions to justify or rationalize these impulsive actions after they have been made, rather than actively mediate between unconscious desires and moral principles. The ego does not regulate the id's impulses before action, but works to create a coherent narrative afterwards, making sense of the behavior in a way that aligns with the individual's self-image and societal norms. The post hoc nature of the ego: cognitive dissonance and justification. The theory that ego serves as a post hoc rationalizer aligns with well-established psychological concepts such as cognitive dissonance and dual process theories of decision-making. According to cognitive dissonance theory, individuals experience discomfort when their actions conflict with their beliefs, values, or self-concept. To reduce this discomfort, they engage in rationalization, a process in which they adjust their beliefs or perceptions to make sense of their actions. For instance, someone who acts in a morally questionable way might later justify their behavior by altering their beliefs or interpreting the situation in a way that alleviates the cognitive tension. This process of rationalization is precisely the function of the ego as a post hoc mechanism. When the id generates an impulse, say the desire to indulge in a pleasurable activity, the ego steps in afterward to create a justification for that action. The ego helps the individual align their behavior with their self-image and the social norms internalized by the superego, thereby preserving the psychological balance and reducing internal conflict. This process occurs after the behaviour has already taken place and is not a conscious effort to control the initial impulse, but to reconcile it with the individual's moral framework. Similarly, dual process theories of decision-making propose that people operate through two distinct cognitive systems. System 1, which is fast, automatic and emotional, and System 2, which is slower, more deliberate and rational. Most decisions, especially impulsive ones, arise from System 1, driven by emotional and instinctual responses. System 2 comes into play afterwards to justify the emotional decisions made by System 1. In this framework, the ego is akin to System 2, stepping in to explain and rationalize decisions that have already been made by the id, System 1. The ego, therefore, is not the primary force regulating behavior, but rather the cognitive process that interprets and justifies actions in a way that aligns with the individual's conscious understanding of themselves and the world. The role of the superego: moral influence and post-decision rationalization. Another key aspect of Freud's original model is the superego, which provides a moral framework for the individual by internalizing societal norms and values. In the traditional interpretation, the superego serves to regulate the id's impulses by imposing moral restrictions, helping the ego to navigate the tension between desire and morality. Critics of the post hoc rationalization model might argue that the superego plays a more active role in regulating impulses and decisions, particularly those related to ethics and morality. However, this view overlooks the role of the ego in moral justification. When the id generates an impulse that conflicts with the superego's moral values, such as the desire to cheat on a partner, the ego does not mediate between the two forces before the act, but instead steps in afterward to rationalize or explain the action in a way that aligns with the individual's self-concept. The superego may influence this process by providing moral standards, but it is the ego that bridges the gap between the impulse and moral conscience through rationalization. For instance, after engaging in immoral behavior, an individual may justify their actions by convincing themselves that they were under stress, that they deserved the pleasure, or that their partner was neglectful. This rationalization is not an active mediation by the ego, but a post-decision reconstruction of the behavior. Thus, the superego's role is one of providing the moral framework for justification, while the ego plays the essential role of making sense of the id's impulses in a way that preserves the individual's self-image and social standing. Neuroscientific support: emotional impulses and cognitive justification. Now, modern neuroscience provides significant support for the argument that the ego functions as a post hoc rationalizer rather than a mediator. Research has shown that emotions, which arise from the limbic system, play a critical role in decision-making. Emotional impulses can trigger automatic behaviors that are not initially subject to rational control. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for higher-order cognitive functions, such as planning, reasoning, and impulse control, is often recruited only after the emotional decision has been made to justify it and reconcile it with the individual's broader goals and social norms. For example, studies of decision-making in individuals with damage to the prefrontal cortex show that they are often impulsive, acting on their id's desires without the ego's rationalizing influence. Now, this suggests that the prefrontal cortex role in the decision-making process is more about justification and post hoc rationalization than active regulation of impulse. Now, the ego as a post hoc rationalizer. In conclusion, the argument that the ego functions primarily as a post hoc rationalizer of the id's impulses, rather than as an active mediator between the id and the superego, is both scientifically grounded and conceptually sound. The id initiates emotional and impulsive decisions, and the ego follows these decisions by creating a coherent narrative to explain and justify them. This process aligns with findings from neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and behavioral science, all of which emphasize the primacy of emotional impulses in decision-making and the rationalization that follows. The ego does not regulate impulses before they happen, but helps to make sense of them afterwards, ensuring that the individual's actions are consistent with their self-image and societal norms. By reinterpreting the ego in this way, we gain a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of the complex relationship between emotion, reason, and behavior in human psychology. A new understanding of mental illness and therapy. Now, if the ego is indeed a post hoc rationalizer of the id's emotional impulses, mental health issues such as anxiety and depression may arise from dysfunctional emotional processing and the inability of the ego to create coherent narratives around emotional experiences. New therapies such as emotion-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy with an emphasis on rationalization, acceptance and commitment therapy, and mindfulness could be effective in helping individuals recalibrate their ego's relationship with emotional impulses, reducing maladaptive rationalization and improving emotional regulation. These approaches would focus on helping individuals understand, accept, and appropriately process their emotional states rather than just justifying or suppressing them. This shift in therapeutic focus could lead to more effective treatments for a wide range of mental health conditions. Language as a tool for enhancing the ego's rationalizing capacity. Language plays a crucial role in shaping human cognition and emotional regulation. The words we use to describe our emotions can influence how we experience and make sense of them. An expanded vocabulary allows individuals to articulate complex emotional experiences in ways that are more accurate and reflective of reality. The more words an individual knows to describe their emotions, the better equipped the ego is to rationalize these emotions in a meaningful way. By expanding vocabulary, individuals can develop cognitive flexibility, the ability to categorize and contextualize emotions in nuanced ways. This in turn allows the ego to better integrate these emotions into a coherent narrative, helping the individual make sense of their experiences and ultimately regain control over them. For example, someone experiencing depression may have a limited vocabulary to describe their feelings, leading to an overgeneralized sense of hopelessness. By learning words like hopeless, disappointed, frustrated, and isolated, the individual might be able to differentiate between emotional experiences that were previously conflated, enabling the ego to rationalize the emotional state more accurately. Furthermore, a richer vocabulary can help individuals with disorders like anxiety or autism regulate their emotional responses by allowing them to more precisely identify and categorize their feelings. The ego may be more adept at processing emotional states if it can draw on a wide range of linguistic tools to make sense of the experience. For example, instead of simply labeling an overwhelming feeling as stressful, an individual might recognize it as overwhelming anxiety or nervous anticipation, which can provide clarity and better rationalization, thus reducing anxiety levels. Expanding one's vocabulary can significantly enhance the ego's ability to rationalize emotional impulses. By enabling individuals to more precisely identify and categorize their emotions, a larger vocabulary strengthens emotional awareness, improves regulation, and promotes healthier mental states. This hypothesis suggests that the ego's function as a post hoc rationalizer can be optimized by linguistic tools, facilitating better emotional processing and reducing maladaptive behaviors associated with mental health disorders, such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, and psychosis. As a result, language development should be integrated into therapeutic interventions, empowering individuals to create clearer and more coherent narratives of their emotional experiences, ultimately promoting psychological well-being. The evolution of language as a tool for cognitive resilience. The ego is more than a mere mediator between the id and the superego. It represents the cognitive processing center that attempts to make sense of emotions in a way that allows individuals to act adaptively in a social and environmental context. As emotions are triggered by the id, they are filtered through the ego for interpretation. However, if the ego lacks the cognitive tools to interpret those emotions effectively, it can lead to maladaptive behaviors and emotional instability, manifesting in conditions such as anxiety, depression, and psychosis. Vocabulary expansion as a cognitive tool for rationalization and emotional processing. The ego as a cognitive processing mechanism benefits significantly from the complexity of language. Vocabulary expansion is not simply a means of naming emotions. It is a cognitive tool that reshapes the very architecture of thought and offers new paths for emotional rationalization. This hypothesis extends beyond Freud's basic structural model of the id, ego, and superego, drawing on insights from neuroscience, neuroplasticity, and linguistics. It suggests that language itself is neuroplastic, and its expansion rewires the brain's cognitive emotional pathways, directly enhancing the ego's ability to rationalize and regulate emotional states. Conclusion: reframing vocabulary expansion as a cognitive rewiring tool. The argument for vocabulary expansion as a means of strengthening the ego and improving emotional regulation is both scientifically sound and neurologically compelling. Expanding vocabulary rewires neural pathways in the brain, enhancing the ego's ability to rationalize and regulate emotions. This hypothesis integrates insights from neuroscience, cognitive science, and linguistics to offer a comprehensive solution to emotional dysregulation associated with mental health disorders such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, and psychosis. Rather than merely serving as a surface-level intervention, language expansion restructures how the ego processes emotional experiences, enabling individuals to better categorize and rationalize those emotions. By improving emotional literacy, we strengthen the ego's capacity for emotional resilience, offering a new avenue for therapy and mental health treatment that complements existing approaches. While mental health disorders are complex, language remains an indispensable tool in cognitive processing and emotional regulation. Expanding vocabulary, far from being a superficial technique, offers a neuroplastic solution to strengthen the ego and enhance mental health, providing a compelling, universally applicable argument for integrating language development into therapy practices. The individual elements of the arguments in this presentation, the importance of language in emotional regulation, the ego's role in emotional processing, and the neuromechanisms involved, are grounded in well-established psychological and neuroscience research. But the specific combination of these elements into a single unified theory that argues vocabulary expansion directly enhances the ego's ability to manage mental health is original in its presentation. There is no evidence that any published work has directly synthesized these ideas in the exact way this presentation has. While related concepts such as language effect on emotional regulation, neuroplasticity, ego theory, and emotion regulation in therapy exist in literature, the exact claim that vocabulary expansion directly strengthens the ego and can address mental health disorders has not been presented as a comprehensive argument before. Thus, while the individual components and ideas behind this presentation have roots in existing fields of study, the specific hypothesis and the integration of these ideas into a unified therapeutic approach are novel and have not been published or presented in this exact form. So what do you think? I'd love to read your comments.